So, welcome to the Taxpayers Protection Alliance inaugural self-isolation quarantine video cast. To all of our viewers, I know this is a very difficult time as both our economy is suffering from one of the worst potential downturns in our lifetimes, as well as the potential human health crisis that the coronavirus has had. So we are now trying to reach out to our members, our viewers, our supporters at the Taxpayers Protection Alliance and try and provide regular updates. To those of you who don't know me, my name is Tim Andrews. I'm the Executive Director of the TPA, and joining me is Ross Marchand, our Policy Director. So Ross, great to have you here with us.
Thanks. Great to be part of the inaugural episode of this crazy situation, this crazy quarantine happening.
So Ross, I think that it's really important that government gets the policy outcomes right. This is an unprecedented shock to the economy, and we really need to make sure that the government just doesn't make everything worse from an economic response perspective. So I know you've been doing a deep dive and spending the last couple of days in isolation, just poring over all of the documents of everything that's been happening. So do you want to give our viewers a quick summary of what on earth is going on?
Well, I think there is a great deal of confusion about what the government is up to, what members of Congress are proposing, and what sort of financial aid, if any, is going to come to individuals, to families, and to businesses. So the saga starts off 2 weeks ago to this day, on March 6th, President Trump signed into law a bill. It's $8 billion. That's about $65 per household. Roughly, I don't know, Tim, if you agree or disagree with me on this one, probably like a month's supply of toilet paper. Does that sound right?
I think at this point, a supply of toilet paper is worth, several $1,000s in some places. But
that's true. That's true, right? Where is legal to procure at such a high price? But this money went mainly towards trying to develop some sort of vaccine or treatment or diagnostics related to the coronavirus. So a lot of that $8 billion, for example, went to the Department of Health and Human Services, and it went to state and local health departments across the country, really just to try to develop a preliminary response. So that was the first major bout of the Trump administration and Congress trying to do something in terms of directing taxpayer dollars to get a grip on this crisis. And then more recently, we've been seeing the development of more substantial sort of changes to the spending system in the US. And in fact, just 2 days ago, we saw President Trump sign into law a paid family and medical leave bill. It's probably going to cost $180 billion. So we're dealing now with more than $1,000 cost for each and every household across the country. And you have a huge mandate imposed on most businesses across the country saying that if you have just come into contact with a COVID-19 patient, or maybe you yourself have been diagnosed with COVID-19, you should stay home and not work for up to 3 months and collect 2/3 salary for that period of time. And the question is, where's all that money coming from to enforce that mandate? And the answer is largely you and me, taxpayers. Because if a business cannot afford all of these expenses, which of course most will not be able to afford these expenses, then the government, Uncle Sam, you and me, will mail them the difference. So it's a huge taxpayer cost. And now, of course, that leads up to the third and final bill to address this crisis, which is under consideration, and people are still talking about it in the Senate, in Congress, and that's probably going to involve $1 trillion in spending. Probably more than $7,000 cost for each and every household.
Sorry, how much for every household was that?
Over $7,000 for each and every household across the country. So this is no small cost. So we need to make sure that we get this right and make sure that we provide targeted relief, not leave anyone out, but at the same time not subsidize the Warren Buffetts and the Mitt Romneys of the world. Very important to get this right.
Very important not to subsidize Mitt Romney. I'm sure most of our viewers would.
Yeah, Mitt Romney in particular.
Maybe that could be an anti-Mitt Romney perspective, sort of amendment to the bill. But look, one of the things that I really wanted to discuss with you, because there's been a lot of discussion about this, is the issue of airline bailouts. As you would know, Airlines for America come out saying that all 7 major American airlines are likely to go bankrupt by the end of
Yeah.
the year.
Right.
Now, normally as taxpayer groups, we're against bailouts. Like, the taxpayer should not bail out a private business. Like, private businesses need to ride the market if there's a downturn.
Right.
So it is.
So Tim, to interrupt you real fast, I saw recently that you wrote something, a piece appearing in Town Hall recently, saying that under certain conditions, interruption of private property rights or something like that justifies temporary relief to an industry like the airline industry. Can you expand a little bit on that point?
Sure. So this is a particularly unique situation. And one of the issues that I was trying to grapple with, and I know a number of other people, like Oren Cass wrote a similar piece yesterday as well, is we believe in private property rights as a fundamental principle. Like, there is nothing more important to a functioning democracy than private property rights. It's the, the old saying, it's the guardian of all other rights. Without private property, we have nothing. And what you essentially have is, in terms of airlines, but also in terms of bars, in terms of restaurants, in terms of cafes, the government has come and said, you're not allowed to use your private property. You're not allowed to fly your planes to Europe. You're not allowed to open your doors to customers. You're not allowed to use your private property. So as believers in private property rights as the cornerstone of the free market, this concerns me because the government has essentially nationalized businesses. They may not have come out directly and said, we are seizing your property, but by saying you're not allowed to use your property, the de facto position is it's a regulatory taking. It may not be a legal eminent domain taking, but a taking of the fruits of an asset by regulation is essentially a seizure of property. There is no difference between a government saying we're going to take possession of your bar or your plane and the government saying you're not allowed to use it. The end result is the same. And so from this private property rights perspective, I think that we can make a coherent intellectual and philosophical, if not legal, argument that because the government is seizing private property, I mean, and again, this is something that goes down to the very fundamentals of the US Constitution, which talks about just compensation for the seizing of property, that there is an argument to be made that providing relief to bars, to restaurants, to airlines, where the government is prohibiting the use of their assets, is justified and isn't in fact a bailout.
Now, just to push back a little bit on that point, we're talking about just compensation for some sort of regulatory taking or limitation imposed by the government. Could you use that argument, though, in its extreme to justify all sorts of government subsidies to all sorts of businesses if, for example, there's just a little bit of regulation restricting these businesses? So where do we draw the line in making this argument?
Sure. And look, this is a very difficult situation, and that's a really good question. I would draw the, and I would actually say, though, as a precedent, if the government starts to think about having a potential cost for any stupid regulation, then that's actually not necessarily a bad thing. Like, maybe the government wouldn't be so easily led into all of these dumb regulations if there was a cost to them. Like, we're already seeing now all of these stupid regulations, like TSA is now allowing carry-on bottles of hand sanitizer. We're now seeing delivery services that bars and restaurants can actually use Uber to deliver cocktails and wine with their meals. We're seeing all of these stupid regulations are now gone to the wind in this crisis, which means there was no point for them in the first place. So maybe if there's actually a penalty for the government to start thinking about the consequences of their actions. I mean, I know this is taxpayer dollars anyway, but like, this still matters to legislators. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But to answer your question more directly, I would say it's a question of not if someone is impacted by regulation, but if they can no longer use their property at all. So if, for instance, in this case, your bar is shut down by the government, then you can't use your property. Whereas if the government simply changes licensing regulations, that's not as direct. If a better example would be and I'll be interested in your thoughts on this, if you're a farmer and you have farmland that you harvest and the government says, because of biodiversity, you can no longer plant crops on a third of your farmland.
Mm-hmm.
So a third of your farmland now cannot be used. Should the farmer be compensated? And I would argue that there's a good argument in favor of that.
Yeah, it's an interesting open question, and I'm happy that people are finally having this discussion. I would argue, and I think maybe you would argue this too, that it depends on the severity of the takings, of the government limitation on that property right, and you just need to sort of take a look around, right? And this is a mistake that many people on the right, conservatives and libertarians don't do. Take sort of a bird's eye view and look around and see what the context is. If you have a crazy catastrophe like this, prompting government regulations that are really restricting the majority of businesses. Now, we've seen this across the country with bars and restaurants and airlines with all these travel restrictions. That could be justified. I would just argue that you have to be very careful. Now, what we're yeah.
No, absolutely.
But,
and there's also
yeah.
there's also the question of what the best possible relief is, because taxpayers need to be protected also. Like, we do
Yes.
need to look at both sides of the equation. I mean, the government isn't an abstract entity. I mean, we pay for this through our taxes, which is why in the long term, the best answer, like, so there's the short term and the long term answer here. In the long term, the best answer is cut the taxes and cut the regulations to actually.
We bleeped that out, by the way. Just for the audience, we bleeped that out. But yeah, I mean, no, I couldn't agree.
I self-censored in the same way as we're self-quarantining.
You didn't hear the bleep, but that's only because of really good editing. We have very good editing staff at the Taxpayers Protection Alliance.
So if we look at what, like, for airlines, for instance, what can we do in the long term? Cut all of the excises, the travel taxes, the tourism taxes, the fuel taxes, all of the passenger taxes. Like, that's a good way, because it'll drive down costs for the airlines, it'll drive down costs for consumers, it'll spur demand. The airlines are also one of the most heavily regulated and one of the most unionized industries. I mean, American Airlines has spent the last 4 years in court with the mechanics who are causing slowdowns, who are disrupting flights. Free the market from that perspective and let airlines be profitable. For bars and restaurants, the same thing. Cut all of the taxes. Cut also the obscene level of labor market regulations. Now that you have millions of hospitality workers being out of a job, I'm pretty sure that they would want to get a job at a slightly lower minimum wage than have no job at all. So that's a way to spur things in that regard. But in the short term, I think that the best way, because there is also a moral hazard issue here, is interest-free loans. Like, whether this be the government directly, or even better, the government can guarantee loans by banks and the private sector, which is, I think, the route the government is going down at the moment with the administration. Mm-hmm. The tax cuts and labour market reforms will be great 8 months from now. They're not going to say bars, restaurants, airlines, other businesses right now, because they'll be bankrupt by them. So I think short-term, immediate reforms would be relief such as interest-free loans, bridging caps, some degree of compensation, because, and I don't think this violates free market principles. Like, people might immediately say, oh, it's government intervention. But from what I said before, this isn't government intervention. This is compensation by the government taking private property away from its rightful owners.
Exactly right. And not an open-ended entitlement, but rather a temporary hand up rather than a handout. Now, what's really interesting is that you're seeing some of the ideas that we've been discussing in turn being discussed on Capitol Hill very recently. In terms of the Senate GOP has released a bill to provide for $200 billion in loans and loan guarantees to some of these businesses that have been hardest hit by the coronavirus pandemic. Not interest-free, but all of this stuff remains up in the air and is open to negotiations. Republicans and Democrats try to get together to figure out what to do, right? And the package right now, as it stands, includes more than $50 billion in these loans and these loan guarantees to airliners, as well as a temporary reprieve from taxes on tickets and cargo and fuel. So important steps in the right direction. Now, there is obviously the ideal policies, right, that we would rather have at TPA, but I mean, you cannot let, right, second best considerations get in the way, right, of if we have this ideal policy, right, we have to recognize that sometimes second best can be the way to go, especially in a once in a lifetime crisis like this. So Tim, I don't know, what are your thoughts on the development of some of these ideas that are floating around right now on Capitol Hill?
Well, I mean, I think, Ross, you should be pretty proud of yourself, because I know that when you put out your proposals, a lot of them were actually a couple of days later pretty much identical to what Congress seems to be doing. So I think that,
they're on our website, folks. They're on our website.
So, like, I think what you came up with them on Monday, we put them up on Monday, and then by Wednesday, this was very similar to what Congress was doing. So, well done to you. And look, we can't let, as you say, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We have to be pragmatic that politicians and lawmakers aren't going to do everything we want. But overall, the administration seems to be trying to do what they can, that's what's best in these difficult circumstances. But I want to actually go on a quick segue here about lawmakers, because whilst almost everyone has been doing the right thing, and and I think there's been a bipartisan attempt in many ways to work together as a country. One thing that I found absolutely reprehensible, and I'm sorry for going on a tangent here, but absolutely despicable and morally vile, is the fact that there were some lawmakers who tried to use the coronavirus response to insert their own sort of pet personal issues, which would benefit big, special interest groups at the expense of the American people. I mean, for one example was some lawmakers trying to put in a pro-insurance company subsidy, which would rip money out of doctors and hospitals at the time we need it the most, to try and pay off to them under the guise of, oh, we need to build a surprise bill. Like, fortunately, this was laughed out of Congress, it looks like, because it was just so repulsive.
It was not a keeper, correct.
Like, the certain lawmakers to actually think, because they have a vested crony capitalist interest, that they're going to try and sneak this in. Another one is subsidies to really, really rich people who have electric vehicles. I'm sorry, electric vehicle subsidies in this...
At a time like this. Insane.
Like, we're in a crisis, and you wanted to give big money to rich people and electric vehicle manufacturers, and people wanted to slip this in under the cover of night whilst everyone was panicking about coronavirus. Like, how repugnant is this? That while people are dying, while millions of Americans are out of a job, like millions of Americans have literally become unemployed in the last week, that you still have lawmakers who are trying to still put their own pet personal issues above the good of the country. Like, I know that, we may not have the best opinion of a lot of lawmakers at the best of times being a taxpayer, and I'm sorry if I'm getting a bit emotional here, but I still find it
get as emotional as you would like.
At the absolute corrupt moral nature of some of the lawmakers who are trying to push for these things.
Absolutely, yeah. Now, talking not to spoil a perfectly good rant, right? But
no, I'm going to calm down. I'm going to have a cup of tea from my nice capybara mug.
It's very nice and it complements your tie very, very nicely.
Thank you.
Very nicely. But to put a little bit more of an optimistic spin on things, when we're talking about payments to rich individuals, what do we make, right, of the single biggest provision that's being discussed right now in Republicans' proposal that's floating around right now in the Senate, to have $500 billion, by the way, to give individuals and families checks in the mail. And this would be means tested, by the way, and it would depend on income. So if you're an individual, right, and you're making up to $75,000 per year, you could get a $1,200 check in the mail. But as you make more, let's say you make $85,000, $95,000 a year, that phases out slowly. So more well-off individuals are not getting as much money from Uncle Sam. Do you think that's a feasible approach? And I mean, you were saying how, we were talking about this before, and it seems like Congress maybe took some of our numbers. But how can we best make sure these individual payments are targeted to people who need them the most?
So I think that means testing is the right way to go. Usually I'm a opponent to sharply progressive tax policies and other things. But in this case, means testing is justified. I would prefer if relief is more targeted to people who are suffering. So more like the people who, like I have friends in DC who work in hospitality, like two of my closest friends lost their jobs over the weekend. I think all of us know people in this situation. I would hope that relief gets targeted to those people because again, it wasn't their fault of their own, it wasn't the fault of the industry, it was the government shutting down their place of employment. So I think that, again, going back to what I said, if the government shuts down your place of employment, the flow-on effects from compensation are there. Now, in terms of broad-based payments, I think that means testing as it's done is probably the best way of doing it. I know that, so there was actually this other proposal by Oren Cass that I think that I sent to you before, yes. In which he was arguing clawbacks rather than means testing. Now, I didn't really understand that. Do you want to explain exactly what he was arguing as a better system? And why you think that it's not worth it? Because I think you didn't necessarily agree with him.
Sure. And my understanding is it has to do with benefits being paid right then and then being subject to tax liability depending on what your income is in the future. So the idea is that it's more forward-looking based on your income now and in the future than any sort of means testing proposal that we have currently, which is looking backwards. Because the proposal that we have right now, direct payments to individuals and families, what is that based on? That's based on income from 2018. So needless to say, what your income was in 2018 doesn't necessarily reflect, especially at a time like this when everyone's getting laid off and they're seeing pay cuts left and right, it doesn't necessarily reflect your financial situation right now. So there is a little bit of merit to what Cass is suggesting. But what I would say is that right now in this situation, when people need straightforward answers and quickly, it makes the most sense to do a direct payment and focus as quickly as possible on income verification procedures that we have and what we've used in the here and now. So I think that's the most direct and straightforward way to go about it, even though Cass's proposal is very interesting and thought-provoking.
Well, Ross, I'm noticing that we've now started to get a lag between the video and the audio. I think we lasted for considerably longer than we thought we would be speaking on, but I think this might be time to call it an end to this video, and we'll be doing another video to all of our viewers soon. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Ross, and
thank you.
Looking forward to seeing you all, and please do leave comments in the comment section. We'll be happy to discuss your feedback later. Thank you, Ross. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.